Deck building in Commander is unique. Unlike formats where the available viable meta is set by tournament results and a clear understanding of what you're likely to face, Commander instead puts the power in the hands of each individual player through pre-game chats and a widely available set of cards that frequently can be incompatible with each other due to what many players refer to as power level. Aside from personality clashes and goal differences, one of the biggest barriers to a fun pod is someone who doesn't have a great idea of how powerful their deck is because they, intentionally or not, had cards that outclassed their opponents. It can be pretty easy for newer Commander players especially to bring cards they think of as unplayably slow, monstrously inefficient, or plain old bad, and discover that in a certain mix or against decks unprepared for those strategies, they win far more than expected. This, of course, leads to hurt feelings, fights about what a 7 is, and worst of all, Reddit posts. Today, I want to talk to you about the 3 primary factors I take into account when designing a deck, or look for when I read a deck list. Then Jim's going to join me to chat about how he personally does the same. When we look at building a Commander deck, there are 3 major components that will reflect in our card choices: consistency, efficiency, and intent. When discussing consistency, we're most frequently speaking about pieces that allow your game to progress. Mana fixing, token production, card draw, any number of things that help make it so your deck can do its thing all fit into this. By and large, I would encourage all players to make their decks as consistent as possible. Not necessarily each piece being the same every game, but always being able to do something. Just speaking for myself, I loathe sitting across from someone functionally unable to play, even more than I dislike being that person. Ensuring that you're able to cast spells and build up a board state, or a game plan, is a foundational aspect of deck building. While the meta or power level you're aiming for might change the set of cards that are acceptable to do this, ultimately, I would encourage everyone to design with a good mix of lands, fixing, and recovery in mind. The next category of analysis, efficiency, builds off the idea of consistency to help us see how long the game should go before we expect to be able to start threatening a win. At most tables, this seems to hover in the 8 to 11 turn range. Efficiency is best exemplified by the spectrum of game-ending combos that exist. From the most efficient Thoracle lines to the most ridiculous Ice Cauldron Prosper 11-card win states, shout out to Quad 9s, every deck in some way or another would like us to win the game using those pieces. It's easier to determine the relative power level of win conditions like this because meeting a certain condition will end the game. Broadly speaking, non-combo strategies will be less consistent and therefore have issues like sudden wins or unexpected interactions that can lead to substantially faster or slower wins than you might have expected. That makes it much more difficult to determine how powerful or appropriate the deck is compared to others. One other nice thing about CEDH, other than extremely efficient wins, is that there is a pre-described intent going into the game that helps decide the rest of the deck. Intent is the difference between playing a hard stacks deck with a game-ending combo that can win on turn 6 versus a hard stacks deck that is looking to get its opponents to concede. The biggest pieces that will be looked at in this category are going to be what have largely become memes in the discourse: pet cards and interaction. The intent of the vast majority of CEDH decks are easy to parse out, as they largely fall into the same overarching statement: using every resource and effect to stop my opponent's wins while advancing towards my own win. Effectively, these decks are loaded for bear and expecting to find some, and I don't mean 2/2s for 2. In some other pods, though, it would be seen as gauche at best and rude at worst to actually use removal or counterspells. Obviously, the majority of decks fall somewhere between, and the correct mix of interaction and cards for fun is likely going to be determined by who you play that deck against. When looking at intent, you should be trying to match the amount of your deck that focuses on interacting with other decks with how the people you're playing are expecting to be able to interact with your own. Consistency to make sure things move, efficiency to make sure things end, and intent to make sure everyone is as satisfied as possible. Keeping these 3 pieces in mind when looking at decks helps keep me from mismatching with my opponents. And now, let's bring in Jim to chat about how his own ideas might fit in and if he thinks there are any other points to be looked at in this model. How you doing, Jim?
Alex, I'm doing great. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm fantastic today. So this is actually something I've been thinking about and like working on for a long, long time now. And I really think this 3-step model, at least for myself, captures a lot of what I think about when I read a deck list or I brew a deck.
Right.
And so the 3 pieces being obviously consistency, efficiency, and intent. And so when we look and discuss about this, what are your thoughts on the idea of consistency as it applies to deck building?
I like that you start with consistency in this model because it's it really is foundational to everything, right? Like, and I like the way that you put it earlier, where you said it's not necessarily making the deck samey, right? It's not consistency like you would consider like a 60x4 constructed deck, right? If you were talking about Delver in Legacy, your consistency is, I want to make sure that I get Delver out on turn 1. I want to make sure that I have enough disruption to make sure that the Delver sticks. And then, we're going to play out the game with me getting in for chip damage every turn, three damage every turn, right? That's consistency in other formats. Consistency in EDH, I think, because the format by its nature is a lot heavier on variance, consistency looks more like, am I going to be capable of doing anything? Right? That's, am I going to be capable of disrupting what my opponents are doing? Am I going to be capable of doing any particular thing that my deck does?
Right. One thing that I always look for with that, and it actually slides based on how powerful I'm aiming for the deck to be, is when can I expect to hit my average CMC in mana production each turn? And at certain power levels, like say at CDH, how soon can I hit double my average CMC? Because I know you've talked about in the past a lot about how a big piece of Commander games, especially at a certain power level, once you start moving to really try and be efficient and be competitive, is how soon and how reliably can you have 2 spells come out of your hand.
Yep.
And so it's not necessarily that every deck needs to be focusing on that. I mean, heavens to Betsy, I don't think 10 mana is something that we should be asking of most of the decks that exist in the format. On the other hand, though, if you're playing a deck that has an average CMC of 6, you should probably have a plan to get there before turn 6.
Yeah, and usually when I talk about that, when I talk about double CMC, just to give you folks a little bit of background here, the idea in my brain is that there's a bit of a break point. Is once you get to the point where you can reliably cast 1 spell every turn. That's like, for most, if you look at the average deck in the format, I would say it's probably somewhere between 3 and 4 for average mana value, right? Yeah. And so once you get to that 3 and 4 mark, you notice that your deck starts to actually start doing everything every turn. It's a lot less draw land or draw a card, play a land, and pass, right? You're more consistently playing something every turn. Beyond that, there's another break point where that's in the 6 to 8 mana value range, where you're doing 2 spells per turn on average. And that's when you're able to maybe ramp and play a creature, or you're able to play a creature and leave mana up for a spot removal spell or counter spell or something like that, right? And I believe that in terms of total mana utilization, that 2 mana value or two spell break point is probably the biggest increase in power that you're going to see in an average game. And so I use that to inform when where most of my ramp lives. Because if I'm really trying to get to, say, 6, then Boundless Realms, which is a 5 mana spell, 5 mana ramp spell. It ramps you by a lot, but it doesn't help me get to 6. Right. I mean, it'll technically help me get from 5 to like 10.
Right. But you're not looking to make that jump. You're looking to make the jump from 1 to 3, 3 to 6.
5. Yeah, 3 to 6. That's like where I want the bulk of my ramp to be, And then if I'm in CEDH, then what I'm trying to get to is probably closer to 2 or 3 for my 2 spells per turn breakpoint. And that means that my ramp should live at the 0 to 1 range.
Right. That's where you're seeing things like Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, Birds of Paradise,
Dorks. Mana Dorks,
yeah. And so I think that absolutely fits into consistency and sort of helps show the spectrum of it. But another key piece of it is if your deck relies on another piece, not just mana, but say tokens or cards in the graveyard, you should also have a package that helps ensure that. Because a lot of decks these days aren't just running off of mana. Some of them need cards in hand, some of them need creatures to sacrifice, like an Aristocrats deck, and there are so many graveyard decks these days, I don't even know what to do with them. And so if you don't have a plan for helping make those resources available, what you're going to see is that you might have very powerful effects that you have the mana for, that ultimately don't do anything.
That's like a reanimating spell with nothing in your graveyard.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So keep in mind when we talk about consistency, we're not just talking about, do I have enough lands? Do I have the right colors of lands? Do I have ramps? It's not just that. It's any resource that your deck needs to work, needs to have a way to be present and be, in some cases, refilled. Because there's a lot of times when you might run out of tokens, you might run out of cards in your graveyard if you're delving a lot or something like that. Where if you can't have something in the middle of your game that resets those pieces, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, and I think time is a component of consistency as well, right? Like I was saying with the Boundless Realms example, right? If that is capable of taking me from 5 lands to 10, it doesn't do me much good if what I'm really wanting to do is play something on turn 4, right? It might, if I have much lower ramp in the deck as well. So I'm hitting my 5 mana on turn 3 and then using Boundless Realms to get me to 10 mana on turn 4, that's a different story.
Yeah, that seems pretty good.
But if the resources don't do much if they're not there at the right time, is what I'm getting at. So, I like that you actually separated out consistency from efficiency and consistency from what's the third category? Intent. Because consistency can be any number of things, but it also it's not necessarily tied to winning the game. It's tied to what the deck wants to do, which is not always winning the game as fast as possible, right? We've talked about this a lot in the past where, everybody has different motivations for playing Magic. Some people, it's pedal to the metal, it's win as fast as possible. Some people, like Tomer from MTG Goldfish wants to assemble Kaldra, right? Yeah. If that's the consistency that you're looking for, like Kaldra, no offense, Tomer, Kaldra's not winning the game, but...
Oh no, our comment section.
But if that's the consistency that you're looking for, then you should be setting up your deck to do that with some degree of regularity.
Absolutely. And when we talk about consistency, you don't need to spend a ton of money to get consistency in your deck. You don't need to be going out and buying a mana crypt. You don't need to be going out and paying top dollar for what was the card that got reprinted that dropped from like $100 to $6? 3 visits.
3 visits. Oh yeah, there's a bunch of them. Like Imperial Recruiter, they did that.
And so those are all pieces that speak to consistency. However, each piece of consistency can also speak to efficiency if you're out there trying to find the best, the top level, all of those pieces. So it's not trying to say that every piece fits neatly into one box and in no other boxes. Obviously, there is some interplay. But when you look at it with the intent of something about this has to fit into one of these 3 categories, that helps you understand a little bit better what you're putting into your deck or what's in that deck list that you're looking at.
Yeah, and I would say, the way that it differs in a notable way from efficiency in my mind is, let's say you've got a mono blue deck, right? And you're running as your game-ending combo Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal, right? That's a very efficient win condition. It's 2 cards. It requires a minimal board state, right? It's not a whole lot of mana, right? You're talking about 4 mana, 2 cards, and maybe 1 or 2 mana rocks on board. And that's your required setup. The mana rocks help you get into the situation where you can cast the spells that actually win the game. They're cards that you would be playing anyway, so they're not dead if you draw them outside of the combo. And Dramatic Reversal has some functionality as a ritual outside of the combo as well. This is a very efficient combo, right? So if you put just those cards in your deck, your Mana Rocks, your Isochron Scepter, your Dramatic Reversal, you've got a very efficient combo in that it doesn't require a whole lot of resources to end the game. But consistency is when you're adding in tutors, you're grabbing like, say, Muddle the Mixture and I don't know,
Demonic Tutor.
Yeah, Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Personal Tutor, all of these tutors that act as functional copies of the cards that you need, as well as maybe overlapping it with another combo, like, I don't know, something like Staff of Domination and Metalworker, because Metalworker can work as your rock in the Dramatic Reversal turn and all that kind of stuff. All of these things act to build consistency so that the powerful, efficient thing that you're doing happens more often on average in an average game.
And part of the reason why we say that you might want to build with consistency in mind is, let's say we keep that package in a deck, but now instead of having, 8 or 9 different rocks that can work with it and 4 or 5 different tutors, I'm going to run none of those pieces. Now, all of a sudden, it's still very efficient, but the odds of me hitting it go from probably by most games on turn 7 or 8 to randomly and as early as turn 3.
Yeah, and so I've talked about that in the past as well. I think that type of deck, the type of deck that contains a very efficient win condition. This is like, some people talk about it as magical Christmas land, right? This is when all of the cards fall your way and you just draw this ball and opener and all that kind of stuff. And it puts you in the situation where every once in a blue moon, you're playing a deck and you describe your deck what you see to be as accurately, right? Which is, let's say I close out the game on average, or I try to close out the game on average by turn 8. Okay. But then there's that one-off game where you're just playing it at your game store with some strangers. You describe your deck that way and you draw like Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, Isochron Scepter, Dramatic Reversal, Island in your opening hand. And you've got infinite mana and you've got a mana sink in your command zone or whatever. And you're just like turn 1, boom, 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 assemble Exodia, you're done, right? And then everybody at the table is saying, I thought we were talking about turn 8 and you just closed the game on.
Why did you just pub stomp me?
Right. And people are saying, well, my deck never does this. You hear this a lot. My deck never does this. My deck never does this. And it's frequently in situations where a deck has an efficient win con that's inconsistent.
And so that's part of why I speak to efficiency second, consistency first. Because if you're going to be walking in with something that's that powerful, that has some very narrow interaction points, I don't really want to be having that around people that are looking for a 7, so to speak. Because frankly, they might be ready for something like that, but they are also equally likely to very much not be ready for something like that. And so talking a little bit deeper about efficiency, I think it's perfectly fine to have a deck that does not have a combo in it, to have a deck that is relying on creature damage to get through, heck, even relying on mill to get through. Any number of different win conditions are absolutely fine. The key pieces is you should have some amount of understanding about how long it's going to take you to create a winning scenario.
Yeah, and I would also say if you're tuning and you want to create a better scenario, think about this, right? Let's say you've got an inefficient win condition that you really like. Sometimes it can be really fun to build a deck that does that inefficient win condition very consistently. I've got a deck like this. It's an ad nauseum deck, but it's a casual deck, right? And it's got a very inefficient win condition. That win condition is casting ad nauseum. The deck runs 65 lands, so you draw like 50 cards on average. Then you play Land's Edge and just chuck lands at people until they die, right? The like absolute ceiling for damage output is like 60 damage.
Wow.
So like you're kind of relying on people attacking each other in the mid game, not knowing what you're doing, all this kind of stuff. And then you're playing Ikra Shadiki and gaining a whole bunch of life to make your ad nauseum bigger. And then you chuck lands at people and hope that like 60 damage that you're able to chuck at them is enough.
Right, because at that point, you're counting on the rest of the table to have done 20 some odd damage to each individual player.
And so, but what I do for that is I run, because the deck runs 65 lands, it only runs 35 non-lands. And those 35 non-lands are essentially all pointing in the same direction towards my ad nauseum. I'm running all the tutors. I'm running a ton of land ramp. I'm running just all of this stuff. I'm running like, what's the one? Is it Abundance? The one where I forget what this card is called. We'll put it up on the screen here. It's the one where you choose not land or non-land every time you draw.
Yes.
You flip until you hit the type of card.
And obviously in that deck, you're choosing non-land every time.
It's gas every time, right? It's like 4 mana. It's basically a tutor, right? And so that is the situation where we've got a very inefficient win condition, but it's incredibly consistent. And I like that because it's really easy to describe what the deck does in a really predictable way. And then I never end up in that situation where like turn 1, the deck can't go off on turn 1.
Because it doesn't have the oomph to do it.
Yeah. It's designed to go off on like turn, 6 through 9. Right.
But contrary wise, let's say you put something like Thassa's Oracle in that deck. Now all of a sudden you have a very tight package that doesn't do a whole lot against other CEDH decks, but could absolutely devastate a casual pod.
For sure.
And so by choosing a slightly less efficient use for a card that's very powerful, you've been able to move something from, the tippy top of the power spectrum down into a more reasonable level.
Yep, bingo.
And so when we talk about efficiency, you don't have to be efficient. You just have to know how efficient you are. You don't have to be aiming for a turn 2 CEDH win. What will help you out a lot in your Rule Zero conversations is being able to confidently say, this deck finishes between X and Y, where X is the lowest possible Goldfish Christmas Lantern, And why is I've been interacted with constantly. I've lost all my stuff, and I'm still going to try to win at this point.
And it's when we're talking about the way that people react to decks, we often see, like, if you go on Reddit or you go on social media anywhere on the internet, you see a lot of people that are like, well, I brought my casual deck to whatever, and somebody pulled out their deck and won with whatever. What the feel bads that are created there are created by the delta between the expectation of how the game's going to go and the actual result of the way that the game went, right? So the tighter you can bring those things together, the more consistently people will be able to predict what's going to happen. And then if it happens, then they don't get bent out of shape over it, right?
Exactly.
It's, we talked about this on our other channel, but it's like the toad and the scorpion, right?
Yep.
Like if I say I'm looking to combo off on turn 3 and then I combo off on turn 3, people aren't going to be sitting there like, what are you doing, bud? And you're like, well, I'm a scorpion, man.
I told you I was going to sting you.
Yeah, exactly.
Where contrary-wise, if you're walking in and saying, oh, it's just a 7, I'll win around turn 6 or 7. And yeah, there's some infinite combos, but they're not that good. And then all of a sudden you're Sanguine Bond into Exquisite Blood on turn 4. People are going to be annoyed with you.
Yeah.
And I think to a certain extent, rightfully so. And I think when we really talk about this, one of the easiest ways to figure out and get a sense for power level in terms of efficiency is looking at infinite combos and how fast you can get them out.
Yeah.
And if you start from there and then move down, once you get into some truly casual decks that don't run anything like that don't have board states that ipso facto result in a win. And I will say that I think Crater Hoof in a lot of ways is a combo win.
Yeah.
It's saying instead of, having explicit pieces, it's saying have, 7 or more creatures on the board win the game.
Yep.
Right? It's the same thing, just a different phrasing. But on the other hand, something like my Aurelia the War Leader deck that relies on either commander damage or widely spread damage to get through, I have a heck of a time being able to precisely pin down when I expect that to win. In practice, I've seen it be somewhere around the 7 or 8 turn range, which is why I call it a casual deck. On the other hand, I have seen it be as early as turn 5 with a ridiculous rollout. And so I always try to warn people that it's a fairly powerful casual deck.
Yeah, and again, you're setting that expectation so that if it does go off on turn 5, again, you're saying like it can go off as early as turn 5. I've seen it happen in the past, right? Or like the combos in this deck, in theory, could go off as early as turn 4 or whatever, right? I have to have a really good hand, but it does happen every once in a while,
right? And so we're not really talking about something that's going to take you 10 minutes to explain to someone. Realistically, what you should be able to say is, here's my lower bound and here's my upper bound. And the other thing about this is I think that this encompasses, each one of these pieces encompasses a tiny chunk of what we refer to as power level. But I think there is one piece that refers to most of power level and really helps people understand what they're in for, and that is intent. And to me, intent is the separation between I'm putting this card in because I like it, and I'm putting this card in because it is going to help me win by either stopping my opponents or advancing myself.
And before you comment, we do recognize that those overlap frequently.
Very frequently.
People often like cards that are very efficient at closing out the game.
Right. But my point with this is essentially how much interaction and how intentional you are with that interaction, or the lack thereof, really helps speak to where you're trying to fall in terms of a power level when it comes to gameplay. One of our good friends, Commander Mechanic, actually has a video on the idea of intent in deck building.
We'll toss that up here.
Yeah. And so I highly recommend to go watch it. But essentially, my understanding of the thesis statement of that is that you can play just about anything. And if you play it with an intent for it to be casual, for it to only come out against the decks that are loaded for bear, you're good to go. But you have to play that with intentionality. You have to design with that intentionality. If you just throw it in and then whoopsie daisies gin against some folks, that's not going to go over as well. And so when we're talking about levels of interaction, the broad categories that I see are literally no interaction. I am there to turn creatures sideways. Some interaction, generally a wrath or two, maybe a spot effect. Consistent interaction where you're thinking about, I'm going to need counter spells. I'm going to need creature removal. I'm going to need esoteric permanent removal like enchantment or artifact. And then finally, you get into the realms of CEDH where 20 to 30% of a deck is all based around, I need this gone, I need that gone, I need that to not happen.
Yeah, or you're racing, right?
Exactly.
You're either in a situation where you're reactive and you're trying to play the longer game and anticipate people's threats and deal with them as they come up, or you are dealing with your interaction insofar as you want to protect what you were doing, right? And this is Siggy from the Lab Maniacs put out a post. This was years ago on Reddit, where he classified counterspells as being proactive, reactive, and value generating.
Yeah.
So it was like, a proactive counterspell. This is something that is designed to protect your combo. These are things like Force of Will, Pact of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, all that kind of stuff.
All the ones that work way better against threats coming in than they do against threats coming out.
They're the ones that like specifically counter other counterspells, or they're the ones that you can cast for free because that allows you to fire off your combo earlier without worrying about having to protect it with additional resources.
Yeah, a more recent example of that might be Mystic Dispute out of, I think that was Eldraine or something like that, right?
Yep. And then you've got more reactive things. Those are things like I've found Flusterstorm works really well in that situation. Things like I've seen people play Mindbreak Trap a little bit lately, which is kind of cool. And those are a little bit more on the reactive side. And then you've got the value generating ones that are things like Mana Drain. And, they've got, a little ability tacked onto it. Maybe like Trick Bind because it prevents people from, that might be a little bit more reactive, but also has a little bit of value to it because it prevents people from continuing loops and things like that.
Yeah. And so when I speak about intent interaction, what I mean by that is how much have you thought, or how much has this deck list thought about the types of decks it's going to go up against? The reason all these cards get played in CEDH is because they're specifically looking to counter specific threats that are aware of in the metagame.
Right, they're anticipating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas I think a lot of casual decks don't do a lot of anticipation. They might think, oh, well, I might need a Wrath. Oh, well, I might need a spot removal. But they're not trying to think of a specific card that's in mind that they're going to be using that on. And I think a lot of that it speaks to the difference between, an actual 7 and a 7 because I don't really have a frame of reference.
Yeah, and so what I find is that a lot of decks that you might call lower on the power scale, they're doing a lot more anticipating with their own deck in mind. So like as an example, in my Annex and Siamese deck, I run a lot of small creatures, right? It's like a White Weenies deck. It's got an enchantment sub-theme. Most of the stuff is 2 power or less.
Right.
So I can play things like Fell the Mighty, which I know is going to target my commander. It'll trigger Annex and Siamese because it has heroic, buff my team, and then I get to board wipe everything that's greater than 3 power or 4 power or whatever, right? So it gets rid of all the creatures that might block. It keeps around all the creatures that people don't want to block with, right? Which are usually like Hate Bears or other stuff.
Yeah.
And it's very asymmetrical. So what I'm doing is I'm playing that board wipe in anticipation of my own board state, saying I can break symmetry on this because most of other people are going to be going for bigger creatures than me on average, right? But with, like you said, in contrast with CEDH, you're saying like, how is my deck going to stack up against, Ad Nauseam? If somebody tries to fire off Ad Nauseam on turn 3, what's my plan for that?
How do I deal with a rule of law?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, some of these, their anticipation of that is just, well, I'm faster, right? Yeah. I'm playing Cody and I can just go off on turn 2 or whatever, right? Turn 1 Cody, turn 2 Ad Nauseam and close out the game, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's in terms of intent, when you sort of start to expand your frame of reference to say like, what decks is my deck bad against? And then how can I shore that up? Right. That's that kind of intent behind deck building and increasing your power level to make sure that your deck can do its thing in spite of other people being at the table.
Well, and realistically, that's what meta crafting is at competitive levels. If you look at standard, if you look at modern, that's how they take a deck from being something that might work well and might be consistent and efficient into being a tier playable competitive deck.
Like that's what a sideboard guide is.
Exactly.
Right? That's exactly what a sideboard guide is. It's like, hey, these are the decks that are popular these days. And these are the parts that you can swap in to make your deck more resilient or faster or, just counter their game plan.
Right. And so with that said, say you're somebody like me who gravitates towards, your 8s, 9s, and 10s in the imaginary power spectrum. I need, if I'm going to be going into a casual pod, to intentionally not play those sorts of things, to pull back my natural inclination to say, well, shoot, I guess I get shut down by artifacts, so therefore I'm going to run artifact. No. It's time to pack some very generic removal and just focus on my game plan. Because frankly, that's probably what most of my opponents are going to be doing. And if I can make that clear from the outset by saying, hey folks, I don't pack a lot of interaction because I'm mostly just looking to interact with you in combat. all of a sudden you've made it very clear that you're looking for a more casual game without having to rely on some vague notion of a 6 or a 7.
Yeah, and actually I would tie that back into efficiency and consistency. That's one of the ways that I create really satisfying, in my mind at least, satisfying casual decks is I pick things that are a little bit less efficient and make them incredibly consistent. And I think that that's incredibly, if you're like a min-maxer, like I am, right? I am definitely a min-maxer. If you're a min-maxer, you can pick something that is not Fast Oracle, Demonic Consultation, and min-max the hell out of that strategy, and they tend to make really interesting casual decks.
Right. It's sort of along that line. One deck builder that I see do this a lot is actually Mana Curves.
Yes.
If you look at a lot of the decks that they put out, especially on their article series on TCG Player, they tend to have a lot of ability to get the thing going. But the thing isn't usually a game-ending combo. Usually it's just some Roshin Menanderer stuff or Sfella the Ice Shaper. And the decks perform very consistently and they get things out. And if you go watch their stream, same thing happens. But it's that idea of this is a casual deck that is always going to do something based around this general concept. And I think it fits in really well with your idea between, on the higher end, Bears and Cars, and on a slightly lower end, Aether Lich.
Yeah.
Because your Bears and Cars deck is all about resource denial and making value out of combat through the ridiculousness that is vehicles.
Yeah.
Whereas Aether Lich is, I'm probably going to lose this game, but it's going to hurt the entire time for the rest of you.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually brilliant in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And so like those are the types of things that's a big part of my deck building philosophy is like I ask myself, what's the coolest thing that you could possibly do in a game of Magic, right? Think about this at home. Actually, this is a really cool thing. And let me know what you think the coolest thing that you can possibly do in a game of Magic is. This might be like having a 0 toughness creature. There's a combo that during the combo, you can tap a creature that has 0 toughness. Because state-based actions don't get checked while you're paying costs. And, it's like a news, what is it? Wall of, the one that makes mana.
Wall of Roots?
Wall of Roots. Yeah. It's like news, Wall of Roots, and you can like put -1/-1 counters on things while you're paying costs and then tap it for mana to pay some more costs and all that. So it's like you can, if that is satisfying to you, then what do you do to make that happen? Yeah. Right. If you want if you want to be able to tell a story about something weird that happened in a game, think about something that's worth telling a story about, and then build your deck to be consistently able to do that.
Able to do it. Yeah. Like for example, in the intro, I mentioned a Prosper Ice Cauldron combo that Stephanie Quad Nines and I had talked about a few months back. It's 11 cards. It's insanity. I'll try to see if we can fit them on screen here. But you put all these together and you win the game. And you're using Ice Cauldron to do it, which is just wild because that's basically a useless card.
We'll have the deck list in the description.
Oh, yeah. Any case, point is that to make that work, you need a ton of tutors. You need a ton of mana ramp. You need protection. And you have to say, folks, I have nothing in this deck that's going to touch anything that you have. The only way I win is if you don't touch me. Are you okay with me seeing if I can race to 11 permanents before you beat me?
Yeah, or like I've got my Flash Hulk deck that just plays a whole bunch of 0 drops. It plays like 38 0 drops. And, quite frequently the way that I'm dying or the way that I'm closing out the game is like somebody will wrath the board and I'll Court of Calling in response for Protean Hulk and use the wrath to kill my Protean Hulk. That's great. And we'll do it that way, right? And it's not Breakfast Hulk combo. It's just like you get a whole bunch of 0 drops and Perforos and just donk everybody for 25 or whatever, right? Or 24. But those are the types of things that they like may or may not end the game. But if you like turn the dial down on efficiency and turn the dial up on consistency, and then that sort of informs your intent for deck building, that they tend to be, if you struggle making casual decks, which a lot of people do, I know a lot of people have trouble navigating those waters of what's taboo and what's not. If you use that as a general guiding principle, you'll generally come up with some pretty good stuff.
Well, and moreover on that, I think what this really helps you do is helps you have an ability to speak to what your deck does in a much more grokkable fashion than just saying it's a casual X deck or it's a 7. And I know I harp on that, and I'm sure a lot of people have harped on that in your life. The reason that we don't like 7s is in order to accurately say this deck is a 7, you need to know so much about the format, so much about what's out there. And frankly, I don't even think I'm qualified to say that. I don't think there are many people on the planet that I could actually look to and say, well, how powerful is this on a scale to 1 to 10 and get a realistic answer? And that's not to say that we're all bad at this or that we all need to get better. I don't think it's a worthwhile goal. And so from my perspective, it's much more efficient in terms of social interaction to have an idea of what your deck is looking to do. Because one thing that I see a lot of people complain about, especially when they go into play strangers, is strangers will say, "Oh no, you all flip over your commanders first. I need to reveal my commander later."
They want to meta game against them. Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, while I do understand that impulse, I understand it comes from a tournament grinder mentality where you don't want to give any information away, and you're going to look over my shoulder. How dare you? You're scouting my deck. It's just not that important, in my opinion. And I don't think it should be. Now, if it's important to you, I'm not trying to shame you. I understand where the impulse comes from, but I think it is a lot more fun for everyone involved if they're aware of what they're looking to do. Because that is an aspect of standard and modern that does not port over into Commander. Generally speaking, if you're going to a standard event or a modern event, there'll be a rogue Kithkin deck occasionally. But by and large, you know what you're going up against. It's the same suite of about 200 to 300 cards at most that you're going to see in a given day. And it's probably way less than that. Compared with Commander, you could be seeing cards that you've never heard of, never seen before, or never seen go together that way. And it can even happen just because you're playing against a deck that helps accelerate you, like accidentally wandering a mill deck against a graveyard deck. Does it hurt you? Does it help you? Who knows?
Yep.
And so.
Yeah. So one thing that I noticed while I was listening to you earlier, is that there's really a second component to intent as well. It's not just a deck building thing, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So from my perspective, deck building with intent is one half of it, but the other piece of it is how you choose to play the game.
Right. Right.
And so with that is, are you going to be hardcore cutthroat if you notice that maybe I packed a little bit too much heat for what I'm seeing on the table. Maybe I packed a few too many answers for the things that are stopping me here.
Yep.
And I don't know that I'd ever encourage someone to intentionally lose a game. Frankly, I think that speaks of some really unfortunate mental patterns and arrogance that I just don't want to get into myself. On the other hand, though, if you're comfortably ahead, maybe it's time to let a piece of removal resolve.
Yeah, if you've got a commanding board presence or whatever, and you've got a counterspell in your hand and 5 mana up, and somebody's like, well, I'm going to spot remove your guy. It's like, maybe it's okay sometimes, you can ease off the gas just a little bit, especially if you're en route to winning anyway.
Yeah, because one of the things I see come out of a lot of actual big name personalities in the casual EDH space is the idea that they'd rather lose having done something fun than win having just won. And I think that's actually a very good way of speaking to what I would consider to be a core casual mindset, is it's very much not about the end, it's about the journey. And if you're the type of player that's a little bit more like us, I'd say we tend to fall on the, I'd like to win this game, please, spectrum of things. It's important to have that social awareness of, oh, I am the only one who's cast an instant or sorcery spell that has interacted with someone else's board. Oh, I'm the only person with attackable creatures right now, creatures that can attack cleanly. Maybe it's time for me to take a foot off the gas. Maybe it's time for me to realize that maybe this deck wasn't quite right for this pod and I should switch after this.
Yeah, or do something goofy. And this is actually one of the main reasons why I love the spell Chaos Warp.
Yeah.
Because it's generally a removal spell. It's a very good removal spell, right? Like it makes a creature or permanent or whatever very inaccessible for somebody that might rely on it heavily. But sometimes if we're in that foot on the gas situation and somebody's like, I'm going to path your guy. I'm like, you know what? No, I'm going to Chaos Warp my guy in response. I want to see what I'm going to get. Right.
Exactly.
And it's the kind of thing where using a piece of spot removal in a way that you might not generally, if you have a big creature, if you've got I don't know, maybe you're playing Esper and you've got that zombie that is the size of all the creatures in graveyards. Lord of the Void.
Yeah,
I think it is. And somebody goes to remove your creature or whatever. You're like, no, I'm going to Swords to Plowshares my guy and gain 40 life. Right. Yeah. That kind of thing where it's you definitely could sit on that Swords to Plowshares and wait until somebody attacks you. And
exclusively the optimal play that will increase your winning percentage by 0.4.
Yeah, you can kind of that. That is one way that you can kind of ease off on the gas and make maybe a suboptimal play that might make the game a little bit more interesting for everybody at the table.
Exactly. On the contrary hand, let's say you're a more casual player and you've drug the game out 15, 16 turns, 3 hours long, and maybe the other players weren't expecting that.
Yeah.
Maybe at that point, it's time to let things happen, let things end, not protect yourself when you could. Because ultimately, I think those are two of the major points of friction between folks, is folks not getting to play the game and folks not letting the game end.
Yeah. And like, that's the situation where you can maybe, a little bit of a vibe check on the table.
Exactly.
Do people have their cell phones out? Maybe just the next time the play goes around the table entirely, just like in your brain, assign percentages to how much each person played, right? We talked about chess clock example in one of our previous episodes. And, if one person is taking 80% of the time of the game,
It's not good.
it's not good. Like maybe if they're moving to end the game and you can stall the game a little bit, just like maybe let it happen and see if the next game is better.
Exactly.
Right. Because the outcome of the game for most people is not like, it's important, but it's not the only thing that matters in the night. They want to have fun with their spare time.
Right.
So yeah. Anyway, tie this one around, tie a bow around this one.
So
for me, Alex.
essentially the thing I want to talk about here at the end is that consistency, I think, is for everybody. Efficiency needs to be understood, but ultimately the biggest test of power level in my mind is your intent. How much interaction are you packing? What is it for? How much have you thought about what you're going up against? Being able to put those pieces together gives you the ability to talk about the deck you've chosen in a way that's extremely efficient, very easy to understand, and generally allows other people to make informed decisions about what they want to play against you. What that will lead to, I think, in the long run, at least my experience has been, very satisfying games, especially games with people that you might not otherwise have played with. Because one thing that I absolutely hate is feeling like I've made someone's day bad by playing too powerfully. And so one way I tried to deal with that was just completely underplaying against decks, but that's not satisfying to me. And that's what helped me develop this, is finding a way to play outside your comfort zone in a way that you might not instinctively understand, but gives you the ability to understand where other people are coming from and play at that level.
Love that. Love that. I honestly have nothing to add. I think that's a great wrap up.
All right. Well, thanks so much, folks. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. If you haven't liked the video, give us that thumbs up. If you've got something that you want to quibble with us with, please put it in the comments. I love reading your comments, especially when they're constructive. And if you're into Flesh and Blood, we also have another channel we're going to link down below. You just want to check that out too. I'd appreciate it. And aside from all that, I just want to say thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.
Hey, thanks for checking out the Spike Feeders on YouTube. Before you close the window, make sure you click subscribe for more weekly Magic content.